Bill. Thanks. Only those of you at Security on Econ yesterday who were there at the beginning would probably get that. So, all right, good morning. Welcome to the Living in America track. Obviously, we planned this very well, standing room only. I think that's actually pretty awesome that it's standing room only in this talk. We have now exceeded 700 check-ins this morning. So let that digest us for a second. Little old Augusta, Georgia. We had 711 check-in as of about a minute ago. That's why I pulled the thing off, because that's what he was saying in the ear. So I think that's pretty awesome. So thank you all for coming out and making B-Sides Augusta awesome again, 4th year in a row. Our next speaker is, that's easy for me to say, works in the mission of national defense, works right here on Fort Gordon on one of the cyber protection teams out there on Fort Gordon. He's got a lot of good things to say this morning. I did forget one other note of administrivia. Lunch is actually going to start a little bit before 12, right? So right when Keelyn wraps up, you'll be able to go right out to lunch so there's not a big onslaught. If you guys don't know where that is, down this hall to the right, follow your nose to Chick-fil-A, okay? So next speaker, again from the CPT, I give you Keelyn Roberts.
Thanks, Phil, and welcome to Finding Evil in DNS Traffic. A little bit about myself. I have about 10 years of experience in both cybersecurity and information system security. A couple recent projects of mine that I've worked on is Mercenary Linux, which is a hunt distribution, a lot of Dockerized applications that we use a lot, and a lot of custom tools that we've written, which is PM by Daniel West, and also the Mercenary Hunt Framework, which again, created by myself and PM by Daniel West. A couple places you can find me, Real Slacker 007 on Twitter, GitHub, Slacker 007 is my repo. All right, so we'll go and we'll talk about a little bit of my motivation for what prompted me to do this research. We'll talk a brief DNS overview, and then we'll talk about some of the malware families that actually utilize DNS for C2 and data exfil, as well as some other exploits. We'll talk about some IFCs and a few detection methods. So why DNS? I had that question asked to me probably 20 times, because overall, for the most part, DNS is pretty boring. That's one of the reasons that makes it really, really vulnerable, because it's one of those things that it just sits there and runs seamlessly in the background, but it has an enormous impact on all of our network communication for a lot of different assets that we have on our networks. And so that was pretty much the technical motivation, but my individual motivation was I was actually put on an assignment to analyze DNS traffic on a training op, and they were actually using DNS for C2, and I couldn't detect it. So obviously I know I needed to go back in the books and do more research, and so decided to bring that here and share it with everybody here. So brief overview. Obviously DNS user wants to access a resource on a network. First checks with its local recursive server. From there, if the local recursive server doesn't have the record that he's looking for, it forwards it up to the authoritative server, and from there to the top level domain root, and then the root. Once the answer is found, it's returned back to the user, and then they're able to browse to whatever asset they originally wanted to gain access to. For the purpose of this brief, whenever I mention infrastructure, I'm talking about everything from the operating system to any other services that are nested on the system itself, to include the DNS application as well. And when I mention protocol, I'm talking just the DNS protocol, okay? So some of the operating systems, we got both Windows and Nix, and on Windows, you have Windows DNS, or Nix, they'll be running bind. These are some of the most common ways that they're attacked: buffer overflows, race conditions, misconfigured permissions. Pretty much basically the user or the administrator configures stuff. Those are ways that the infrastructure itself can be targeted. Other nested, and the nested services on it as well, FTP, if they're nesting web on there as well, SMB, SIFs, things of that nature. The protocol introduces several different vulnerabilities: DNS cache poisoning, DNS spoofing, distributed denial of service attacks, data exfil, command and control, and staging for further exploits. A lot of threat actors utilize this all the time to conduct all these activities. So we'll start with DNS cache poisoning. Pretty much, it's self-explanatory. The cache on either the local system or the DNS server would be modified by an attacker. The unsuspecting user goes to access a resource, system checks local DNS cache, is not there, it checks the recursive server. It's been poisoned, and it returns the IP or the address for the attacker's resource, and the user unknowingly browses to the fake website and checks his email. Recursive servers and local DNS cache, those are the two primary targets. Recursive servers actually aren't targeted for DNS cache poisoning attacks as much as they were in the past. This is largely due to a lot of security features that's been built into a lot of the applications, such as bailiwick rule and birthday paradox. Primarily, you'll see DNS cache poisoning take place on the local system. That's either within the local cache on the operating system itself or on the web browser. Some of the malware families we have mentioned, I want to point out the DNS changer. That's actually been around since 2011. DNS changer, it originally targeted like local DNS cache on the system, and now, as of 2016, is actually morphed into targeting the default gateway and modifying the DNS records and the DNS configurations in the default gateway and controlling all their traffic for the network that way. So that one's really important. 3 aspects that I want to point out for tracking DNS communication: source IP, source port, and transaction ID. So by default, DNS runs on UDP, which is connectionless traffic, not like TCP where it requires a 3-way handshake, and so each session is tracked by the protocol itself. DNS doesn't have that, so it sort of inherits those vulnerabilities from UDP and makes it susceptible to further attacks. I want to highlight source IP because with DNS amplification, it actually takes advantage of this vulnerability. DNS amplification tag, you have an attacker who will send, you have an attacker who controlling a botnet. All of these bots, they will send, at the attacker's request, they will send a very small DNS query to usually an open DNS server, requesting all of the resource records for a given domain. And then at this time, they're spoofing their source address so that all the results are returned to a victim. Some of the indicators of compromise: spoof source addresses, monitoring your network traffic to make sure that the source address spoofing isn't taking place. That should be already being done, but if not, definitely want to implement that. The use of open DNS servers. You should only be using your internal recursive server anyway. So if there's any DNS traffic that's trying to resolve using an open DNS server or any DNS server other than your own, that should be another indicator of compromise. Modified TTLs. If you look in the image that we have to hunttoos.org, you see a difference of 13 with the TTL. That could be the difference in like the US versus Afghanistan. So you definitely shouldn't see a TTL vary that much. So that would be another indicator of compromise in itself. The use of the any record. The use of the any records, it doesn't mean that it's vulnerable by default. However, in conjunction with any of these other, then definitely it would be an indicator of compromise. Especially the quantity. If you have any given number of nodes, we'll say 1,000 nodes throughout your network, all making 100 requests for any resource record for ietf.org with a spoof source address. Obviously, that's an indicator of a compromise. Volume of queries. You have one node that's making 10,000 requests over a short amount of time to a given domain. That's another indicator. And lastly, queries versus responses. Make sure that you have not necessarily an exact match for the number of queries versus responses, but it should be relatively close. You shouldn't have 1,000 or 10,000 more queries than you have responses for a given domain. So that's another thing that you want to pay attention to whenever you're doing your traffic analysis. In this image, I want to highlight three things. The use of the any record, destination, and lastly, the size. If you notice, it's only 68 bytes. It doesn't take a really powerful machine to do that, which makes this perfect for like botnets and distributed denial of services, because you're able to get several systems scattered geographically across the globe to all participate in distributed denial of service to a victim without having any performance hit on their own system or their own network. So if you're not monitoring for it, you could actually be participating in a distributed denial of service attack against another organization and not even know it. So I want to definitely highlight that. This is an example of what that query might look like whenever you're looking at this traffic from a command line based traffic analysis tool like TCP dump, NetSniff NG, something like that, and pay close attention to how small it is. This plays right into what I mentioned before about how small and how little resources it takes to actually generate this query. And then take a look at the response. So this is response generated from that exact same query. Now, if you scale this and scale it across, let's say 100 systems within your network, all doing this 100 times a piece, doesn't impact your network at all because of the size of the query. But remember, they spoofed their source address. So all of this traffic is being redirected from the open DNS server back to the victim. And you can see how that could quickly result in a denial of service because of resource exhaustion. So definitely want to pay attention to those indicators of compromise to try to make sure that not just because you're not the victim of distributed denial of service attack, but you're also not participating in one against another victim. DNS beacons. Some of the key information about DNS beacons. A couple of them, very popular DNS beacon, Cobalt Strikes. Pretty sure everybody's familiar with that. Remote access Trojan that allows you to do a number of things via DNS, both stage further attacks, C2, data exfil, control the number of callbacks that you get like over a given amount of time using throttle or jitter. Another one is DNS Trojan, which is another family of actual malware that you use maliciously a lot. And it does some of the same things similar to Cobalt Strike. Some of the IOCs that it's important to pay attention to whenever you suspect DNS beacons is incremental changes. Pay attention to subdomains. Pay attention to the numbers. It might look like random characters, but everybody knows there's nothing random. So pay attention to those numbers. They have to be changing some way. Size of the packets, UDP versus TCP. In an attempt to remain stealthy, a lot of malware families, they limit the amount of data that they try to pack into those UDP packets, because once they go over a certain size, then it will automatically switch over to TCP. And then that's going to be an indicator of compromise and could potentially cause them to be identified by the security team in the network. So they try to maintain within that 514 bytes of a UDP packet. That actually affects the number of packets because they have to keep the packets so small. They have to generate a lot of them. So now you're going to see, even though it's only 1 meg that they're trying to data exfil, but it generated like 10,000 packets. So you will see a large number of packets just based on that fact alone. And for that reason, It's primarily used as C2, but can be used as data exfil as a last resort. And it's important to know that. And then again, queries versus responses. Because of some of the security features that are built into the application nowadays, if the requests are coming in too fast, a lot of times the server won't process them just because of that. So it'll have to regenerate those queries. So a lot of times you'll look over the network and you might see 3 queries for every 1 response. And that'll also be a great way to, or a great indicator of compromise, and require further like look from your security team. Key attributes for and why. There actually are legitimate uses for DNS beacons and text records, particular. Text records, applications like DKIM and Center Policy Framework actually use this to communicate, exchange information between different assets like email servers and DNS servers about themselves. But one of the places you should not see it is from a host. You shouldn't have hosts on your network or nodes like everyday user systems that are sending DNS text records out. So that would be another indicator of compromise in itself. Some examples of legitimate applications that also use DNS text records and A records are security applications. McAfee, Security Onion, Semantic, they all use them. One of the ways they do it is any binaries, suspicious binaries that they identify, that their application identifies, they'll take it, hash it, prepend that hash to the domain, and then they'll send that out so that they could check that hash against their database and see if they've got any additional hits, or if any other system or if any other network has reported that hash as being suspicious. This is an example of malicious. Obviously, you can see the size, just based on the sheer size, it should stick out, which plays into like a little bit of what I mentioned about my own motivation for doing this analysis. It kind of goes, DNS is one of those things that you just kind of set it and forget it. So if you're not paying close attention, even though this jumps out at you because we're in this brief, if you're not even looking, you're not going to catch it because it's not breaking anything within the RFC. It's the right amount, the right size, the right amount of characters. There's nothing that's breaking any RFC. So you could do this all day, and if you're not checking, then you're not going to see it. You're not going to find it. Another indicator of compromise is resolving to like a wildcard. You'll see here with this domain, it's resolving to 0.0.0. A lot of times this is used because there's an unlimited amount of domains that could come back, especially if you're prepending data and you're encrypting it and base64ing it before you attach it or prepend it to your domain. There's no way of really having every domain registered in the DNS server, so you'd have to sort of resolve to anything. Here's a screenshot of one of the applications, DNS Hunter, that we use, and as you see, you have the same domain resolving to multiple countries. It's IPs in multiple countries: Paraguay, Canada, Germany, China. That should jump out at you. Definitely an indicator of compromise there, and at least requires an additional look. This is another screenshot, same tool, just adding some more command line syntax just to refine the amount of output they were able to get using grep. And now I have some actual videos of some of the tools I want to show.
Keelyn, you have about 3 minutes to the top of the hour.
Okay.
Do that one.
So, all right, a lot of the videos anyway, if you want the videos, I can give you the videos, or they'll be posted on YouTube, so you can catch those. So I'll just leave it open for questions at this time. If anybody got any questions, they can ask, or I'll stick around and you can ask me on the side. Thank you.
Looking ahead of my time.